I woke up to the sound of machines. A slow, rhythmic beeping filled the white room, steady as a metronome guiding a broken heart back into its hesitant rhythm. My chest burned with the raw ache of something that had been opened, touched, and stitched back together by hands steadier than mine. Tubes ran from my arms, one taped carefully to the skin, another trailing to a clear plastic bag half filled with crimson reminders of what had just happened. I turned my head, weak as if a single ounce of strength had been stolen by the sterile air itself. I searched for faces, for my children, for the people I had once carried on my shoulders when they were small enough to believe their father was invincible. The chair beside my bed was empty. So was the one near the window. When the door cracked open, my heart leapt. I thought maybe it was my son, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway light, his hurried footsteps finally coming back to me. Or my daughter, clutching a coffee she bought downstairs, ready to scold me for not taking better care of myself. But it wasn't them. It was a nurse. She glanced at my monitors, smiled politely, and adjusted the blanket. "You're doing okay," she said softly, her voice like a lullaby. And then, as if delivering news she'd been forced to carry many times before, she added, "No one came by today, maybe tomorrow." Her words stung more than the stitches across my chest. No one came by today, maybe tomorrow. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I wished the anesthesia hadn't worn off. At least then I wouldn't feel the weight pressing down, not from my heart, but from the hollow space where my family should have been. I once believed hospitals were places where families gathered, where love showed up no matter the inconvenience. I believed because I had lived it. 40 years ago, when my wife was in labor with our firstborn son, I didn't leave her side for a second. My hands cramped from holding hers, my back ached from leaning over the bed, but I stayed because I thought that was what love did. Now, decades later, after a surgeon had literally held my life in his hands, love seemed to have other appointments. "Work's been crazy, Dad," my son had said 2 days before the surgery, his voice quick, distracted, like he was already running to the next meeting. "You'll be okay, right? I'll try to stop by after. Try after." Words that held the fragility of promises no one intended to keep. And my daughter, sweet and soft-spoken as she had been when she was 10, now only texted, "Don't worry, Dad, we'll check in. Busy with the kids." Check in, like I was a hotel room. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them like rosary beads, hoping each one would numb the ache inside me. My chest hurt when I breathed too deeply, but the greater pain wasn't physical. It was realizing that the people I had once been ready to die for had chosen not to live 1 hour less conveniently for me. A father should not have to beg for company while relearning how to breathe. Still, I told myself excuses. Maybe traffic was bad. Maybe the kids had soccer practice. Maybe they just didn't know how much I needed them. But deep down, I knew. They knew. They just didn't come. When you are alone in a recovery room, time stretches like a cruel elastic band. Seconds sting, minutes cut, hours wound. I reached for my phone once, thinking perhaps a message waited for me. The lock screen was empty. No calls, no texts, just the cold, glowing numbers of the time, 6:13 p.m. I remembered when they were young and the roles were reversed. My son had once spiked a fever late at night, and I drove 2 towns over to find the only open pharmacy. My daughter twisted her ankle in middle school basketball, and I carried her on my back through the rain to the ER. I was there, always there. Now, in the greatest test of my own fragile body, they were somewhere else, laughing at dinner tables I wasn't invited to, wrapped up in schedules that didn't have a line for Dad's heart surgery. I could feel the bitterness growing, but another part of me whispered, "Don't let it. Don't let their absence poison what's left of your heart." So I breathed, slowly, painfully, and I began talking to myself, because sometimes when you're abandoned, your own voice is the only company you can afford. "You'll get through this," I murmured. "You've walked alone before, you can do it again." The nurse came back at midnight, checked my vitals, and lingered just a moment longer this time. Maybe she saw something in my eyes, a shadow, a storm. She touched my arm gently and said, "You're stronger than you think, Mr. Carter." I wanted to believe her. And if you're listening to this right now, If you've ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or left behind by the very people you once sacrificed for, maybe you understand me better than my own children do. This story I'm telling isn't just about a surgery. It's about every father, every mother, every soul who once gave everything and got silence in return. If you know what it feels like, I ask you, stay with me. Follow this journey. Click like, hit subscribe, not for me, but for every parent who has sat in a hospital bed wondering if their love still mattered. Because I'm going to show you something, how a broken heart can still rise, how an empty room can still echo with strength, how even when they leave you behind, you can walk out stronger than ever. That first night, I did not cry. I thought I would, but instead, I stared at the empty chair until dawn broke through the blinds. The sun was cruel in its honesty. It revealed every inch of the chair's vacancy. Still, as the light warmed my face, I made a vow. If they weren't going to walk in that door for me, then I would walk out that door for myself. Even if it killed me. Even if every stitch tore. Because sometimes the only way to survive abandonment is to stand tall in its shadow. And I was ready to try. They say recovery is a waiting game, but no one tells you what you're really waiting for. The doctors said I was doing well. Strong vitals, good rhythm, keep resting, they told me. Resting was the easy part. What else could I do tethered to wires and plastic bags? No, the hard part was waiting. Not for the painkillers to work. Not for the next meal tray with its overcooked chicken and watery jello. I was waiting for footsteps. Every time I heard the squeak of rubber soles in the hallway, my pulse jumped. The door would creak open and I would crane my neck, expecting, hoping. Maybe it's them. Maybe today they finally came. But it was never them. It was a nurse with a chart, a custodian wheeling in a mop, another patient being rolled by in a wheelchair, and always the same sight when I looked beside me, the empty chair. That chair haunted me. Hospitals are full of chairs, waiting rooms lined with them, lobbies overflowing. But the one next to a recovering patient isn't just furniture. It's a statement. An occupied chair says, I care enough to sit here for you. An empty chair whispers, you're on your own. Mine whispered all night. One afternoon, the nurse who brought me my meds must have seen me staring at it too long. She smiled carefully and said, don't worry, sometimes families come later in the week. People get busy. Busy. The word landed on me like ice water. I thought about all the times I had been busy. Busy working overtime, busy fixing leaky roofs, busy paying bills. But even then, when one of my kids had needed me, when fevers spiked or hearts broke, I found a way to show up. Busy wasn't an excuse. Busy was life. Love was showing up anyway. I tried to remember the last time they had really looked at me. Not in passing, not while glancing at their phones, but really looked. My son had a habit, even as a boy, of locking eyes with me when he wanted reassurance. A scraped knee, a failed test. He used to search my face as though my expression could tell him whether he'd be okay. Now, if he even called, it was voice only, never video. I couldn't remember the last time he looked. My daughter, when she was 5, used to crawl onto my lap and say, don't ever leave me, Daddy. She'd loop her arms around my neck until I laughed and promised. I kept that promise, but I guess promises don't run both ways. The chair kept teaching me lessons I never asked for. I learned that silence can be louder than words. I learned that neglect can hurt more than betrayal because betrayal at least acknowledges your existence. I learned that hospitals don't just heal bodies, they expose hearts. And mine was exposed, stitches and all. That night, as the lights dimmed and machines hummed, I imagined them sitting there. I played the movie in my head. My son dropping his briefcase saying, sorry I'm late, Dad, while my daughter's kids raced to the bed, giggling. I imagined the feel of their hands on mine, the warmth of company. But when I blinked, the chair was still empty. Reality was crueler than any dream. At one point, the loneliness pushed me back into memories, because sometimes the past is the only place where love still lives. I remembered the summer my boy broke his arm falling off his bike. I had sprinted 2 miles carrying him because the car was in the shop. My shirt was soaked with sweat, his tears dripping down my collar. He had clung to me the whole way, whispering, don't let go, Dad. I never did. And now I sat in this hospital bed, whispering those same words to a chair that couldn't hear me. The emptiness became a teacher of its own kind. Look, it seemed to say, at who really shows up when you're broken. Look at what family means when convenience is stripped away. Look at the truth you've been avoiding. The truth was this: I mattered less to them than they mattered to me. It was a truth sharper than the surgeon's scalpel. One morning I asked the nurse, "How long have you worked here?" 10 years, she said. "Do you see a lot of patients without visitors?" She hesitated, then nodded. "More than you'd think. People live busy lives. Families drift. Families drift." I wanted to argue, to say families shouldn't drift, not when a father lay cut open on a bed, but I didn't. I didn't have the strength for philosophy. I only had the strength to count chairs. Sometimes I spoke aloud, as though the empty chair were listening. "You know," I whispered one evening, "I used to sit for hours in waiting rooms just like this. Flu shots, dentist appointments, even the DMV line when they needed their licenses renewed. I sat through it all, never complained. The chair offered no reply. You know what the difference is?" I continued, bitterness creeping into my voice. "I didn't think of it as waiting, I thought of it as loving." And then I laughed, though it hurt my chest. It was either laugh or cry. But somewhere in that silence I began to change. If they weren't coming, then maybe I had to stop waiting. Maybe the chair wasn't proof of what I lacked, but proof of what I needed to become: stronger. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. I looked at the chair again, and for the first time I didn't see abandonment. I saw a challenge. Can you fill this yourself? Can you sit beside your own heart, broken and healing, and keep it company? That night I made a decision. Tomorrow I would try to stand. It terrified me. My chest felt fragile, like one wrong movement would tear me apart. My legs were stiff, my arms weak. But I couldn't keep staring at that empty chair, waiting for someone else to give me the will to move. I would find it myself. Because maybe that's what survival really is. Not the absence of pain, not the presence of others, but the choice to rise even when no one claps for you. And so I went to sleep with that thought. Tomorrow I walk, even if no one is watching, even if the chair is still empty, especially then. The phone finally rang. I remember how my heart skipped, not in the dangerous or rhythmic way the doctors warned about, but in the hopeful way of a man starved for connection. I grabbed for it, fumbling against the stiff bandage across my chest. It was my son. "Hey, Dad," he said, voice rushed, clipped at the edges. "How are you feeling?" Just hearing his voice was enough to loosen something in me. I wanted to tell him everything: the loneliness, the empty chair, the way each step felt like climbing a mountain with my chest split open. But I didn't. I just said, "I'm hanging in there." "Good, good," he replied quickly, too quickly. "Listen, I wanted to come by today, but work's insane. My boss needs me on this project, and you know how it is." I didn't know how it was, not really. My generation worked long hours too, but we still showed up when it mattered. Yet I bit my tongue. "Sure," I said. "Work comes first." Silence after my words felt heavier than the tubes pulling at my arms. "I'll try this weekend, Dad, promise." And then he was gone. I stared at the phone long after the call ended, as though holding it tighter might keep him here with me. But the line was dead, just like the empty chair. Excuses. They sound harmless, but when spoken by the people you love, they cut deeper than any scar a surgeon could leave. My daughter called later that evening. Her voice was soft, familiar, like a melody I once knew by heart. For a moment it lifted me. "Dad, how are you? I've been thinking about you." "I'm okay," I whispered. "Tired, it hurts, but I'm okay." She sighed. "I wanted to visit, but the kids had a game today. You know how busy it gets." Busy again, always busy. I closed my eyes and remembered when she was a child, running across a soccer field while I stood in the rain, clapping until my hands stung. Busy never stopped me then. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. "I'll try to come next week," she offered, the way people offer leftover scraps they think you should be grateful for. "Sure," I whispered, "next week." She promised. Then the line clicked silent. Excuses, work, kids, schedules, traffic. They stacked like bricks, walling me off from the very people I thought would storm heaven itself to reach me. And with each one I felt myself shrinking, not because of the surgery but because of their absence. When I was younger, I used to tell my children, love isn't just words, it's presence. If you love someone, you show up. Now I was learning what it felt like when they didn't. Later that night, unable to sleep, I whispered to myself, why do excuses hurt so much? The answer came in pieces. Because they pretend to care while choosing not to. Because they are soft daggers, smiling, reasonable, polite, yet still stab at the heart. I remembered once long ago when I missed my son's school play because I had to work a night shift. He cried. I sat him down and said, son, I had to do it to keep food on the table, but I'll never forget the look in your eyes. That look haunted me for years, and I swore to myself I would never let him feel alone again. But here I was, alone, because my children had broken the very vow I once made to myself. The next morning, the nurse noticed my silence. Rough night, she asked. I nodded. No visitors. I forced a smile. They're busy. She looked at me the way people look at stray dogs, half pity, half admiration for surviving. Then she said something that stayed with me. Sometimes excuses say more about them than they do about you. I thought about that all day. Maybe she was right. Maybe their excuses weren't proof that I didn't matter. They were proof they didn't know how to show love the way I did. Still, that didn't stop it from hurting. To ease the ache, I began writing. The nurse had given me a small notebook just to jot things down. At first, I only scribbled reminders, medication times, tomorrow's tests, but soon the words spilled wider. I wrote the excuses they gave me. Work's crazy. The kids had a game. Next week. I promise. And then I wrote the words they didn't say. Dad, you're worth the inconvenience. Dad, you're still my hero. Dad, I can't imagine losing you. The page became a battlefield between what I heard and what I longed to hear. Sometimes I read it back and felt a strange strength. At least the paper listened. At least the ink stayed. One evening, as I wrote, I imagined confronting them. Not angrily, but truthfully. I pictured my son sitting in that empty chair, phone in hand, eyes darting between me and a buzzing screen. Son, I would say, do you remember the time you fell off your bike and I carried you 2 miles to the hospital? I was tired. I had work the next day, but I showed up, not because I had time, but because you needed me. And I imagined my daughter across from me, arms folded, apologizing. Sweetheart, do you remember when you cried through the night because your first love broke your heart? I had meetings in the morning, but I stayed up, holding you, listening to every sob. Not because it was convenient, but because it was love. In my mind, I spoke those words. In reality, I stayed silent. The truth is, I didn't want to shame them. I didn't want them to visit because of guilt. I wanted them to come because love pulled them, the way love once pulled me toward them. But love, it seemed, didn't pull equally anymore. That night, as machines hummed and the hospital corridors echoed with distant footsteps, I put the pen down and whispered to the empty chair. Maybe one day you'll be filled again. Maybe one day they'll remember what love means. But until then, I'll fill you myself, with my own will, my own courage. Because I can't keep waiting for excuses to turn into presents. And as I said it, a strange fire lit inside me. Excuses might cut deep, but they also left scars. And scars, I realized, don't just remind you of pain. They remind you that you survived it. The next morning, I looked at the chair differently. Still empty, yes, but no longer haunting. Now it was a challenge. And I whispered to myself, no more waiting. Because if they weren't coming, I would rise anyway. Even if it meant pulling the tubes, steadying my legs, and taking that first trembling step on my own. The morning I decided to stand, the world outside my window was gray. Not the kind of gray that promises rain or thunder, but the quiet, indifferent shade that makes you feel smaller than you already are. The nurse had just left after checking my vitals. She smiled, told me to keep resting. But my heart couldn't rest anymore. Resting was what had left me staring at that empty chair for too many days. Resting was what made me believe the lie that I couldn't move without someone beside me. No, today would be different. Today I would stand. It didn't start with some cinematic flourish. There was no trumpet music, no speech. It started with me slowly sliding my legs toward the edge of the bed. Even that felt monumental. The bandages pulled tight across my chest. My ribs ached as though the surgeon had left heavy stones inside me. My hands trembled as I gripped the metal rail of the bed. For a moment I thought I might collapse right there, halfway between lying down and rising. But I whispered, "Come on, old man, just try." The voice sounded unfamiliar, hoarse, cracked, but it was mine. And maybe that was enough. My bare feet touched the cold tile. It felt like standing on ice. I reached for the Roman 4 pole, my unlikely companion. Its wheels squeaked as I pulled it closer, a plastic bag of fluid swaying above me like some strange flag of surrender. But I wasn't surrendering. Not today. The first attempt to push myself upright nearly ended in disaster. My knees buckled instantly, sending a sharp pain up my thighs. I gasped, clutching the pole, and nearly toppled back onto the bed. For a moment I thought, this is stupid. You'll rip your stitches. You'll make things worse. And maybe I would have given up if not for the memory that came rushing in. It was of my son, barely 8 years old, learning to ride his bike. He fell over and over, scraped his knees raw. Each time he looked at me with tears in his eyes, and each time I said the same words, "Get up, one more try." If I could tell him that, then how could I not tell myself? So I whispered the same thing. One more try, and this time I pushed harder. My legs shook violently like saplings in a storm. My breath caught, my chest screamed. But slowly, unbelievably, I rose. For the first time since the surgery, I was standing. The room looked different from up there. Not just because I wasn't staring at the ceiling anymore, but because I had proven something to myself. That gravity, pain, and loneliness hadn't beaten me yet. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the Roman 4 pole like a soldier holding a rifle, swaying but refusing to fall. My heart monitor beeped wildly, as if cheering or warning, I couldn't tell. Then I took a step. It was clumsy, awkward, hardly a step at all. My right foot slid forward a few inches, the Roman 4 pole squealing beside me. My left leg followed, stiff as a rusted hinge, but it was a step. And then another, each one cost me everything. My back dripped with sweat, my breathing ragged, but I was moving, alone, uncelebrated, unnoticed. Yet it was the proudest walk of my life. Halfway across the room, a voice broke the silence. "Oh my God, Mr. Carter." It was the young nurse, eyes wide, hands flying to her mouth. She rushed over, her sneakers squeaking against the tile. "You can't do this by yourself." She scolded, her hands hovering near me as if afraid to touch, afraid to break the fragile miracle unfolding. I grinned through the sweat. "But I already am." She shook her head, muttering about safety, vitals, the doctor's orders. But she didn't stop me. Maybe because she saw something in my eyes, something stubborn, unyielding. So she walked beside me, one hand near my back, the other steadying the Roman 4 pole as I dragged my aching body across that room. Each step was a conversation between me and my heart. "You can't." "I will." "You're too weak." "I've been weaker before." "You're alone." "Then I'll walk alone." By the time I reached the far wall, my vision blurred with tears. Not from pain, though there was plenty of that, but from the realization that I had just crossed a border no one else believed I could. I turned slowly, gripping the pole, and looked back at the bed. It seemed miles away. The nurse whispered, "You don't know how incredible this is." But I did. I knew it in my bones, in my stitches, in the sweat dripping down my neck. This wasn't just a walk across a hospital room. This was proof. Proof that I didn't need excuses or apologies to move forward. Proof that I could rise, even when no one came. Proof that a man with a broken heart could still take steps toward healing. When I finally sank back onto the bed, my body shaking, the nurse patted my shoulder gently. "I'll tell the doctor. He'll be proud." But I didn't care about the doctor's pride. I wanted my children's. I wanted them to see me, to know that while they were busy with games and meetings, their father was teaching himself to walk again. I wanted them to understand that strength doesn't wait for convenience. It grows in the cracks of abandonment. That night I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind was alive, replaying each shaky step. I kept thinking, if I can stand today, maybe tomorrow I can walk farther. Maybe one day I'll walk out of this place on my own 2 feet. And with that thought, I finally drifted into a restless, hopeful sleep. I don't know if anyone will ever truly understand how much those steps meant. To the world, it was nothing. A man moving a few feet within Roman 4 pole. To me, it was everything. It was the moment I realized that being left behind didn't mean being defeated. It was the moment I stopped waiting for someone to save me and started saving myself. And though my children weren't there to see it, though the chair beside my bed stayed empty, I knew one thing. The first step is always the hardest, and I had taken it. Night in a hospital is a strange companion. The halls grow quiet, the fluorescent lights hum, and the machines beside your bed become the only voices left. Their beeps are steady but not comforting. They remind you that you're alive, but also that you're fragile. That night, after my first shaky walk across the room, the pain came back with a vengeance. It wasn't the sharp, immediate pain of the incision, but a deep, gnawing ache, like my bones themselves were protesting the audacity of moving too soon. Every breath felt heavy. Every shift on the mattress sent fire through my chest. I tried to turn on my side, but the bandages pulled tight and I gasped, beads of sweat rising on my forehead. Easy, I whispered to myself. Breathe. But breathing hurt too. It's strange how much silence can amplify pain. During the day, nurses check in, voices fill the space, machines roll down the hallway. But at night, when it's just you and the shadows, pain becomes louder than any sound. I closed my eyes, wishing, just wishing, that one of my children would walk through the door. Not to fix anything, not to erase the pain, but just to sit, to hold my hand, to remind me I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the chair was still empty. It had become a cruel truth. My heart had been cut open, and still, not one of them had chosen to show up. So I did the only thing I could think of. I prayed. Not with fancy words or memorized lines, but with groans, whispers, and raw honesty. God, I said, staring at the ceiling, I don't know what you want from me. My chest is on fire. My children are gone, and I don't know if I have it in me to keep going. The words cracked. My throat was dry. I've given them everything, I whispered. I carried them, fed them, stayed awake when they were sick, showed up when no one else would. And now when I need them most, they're nowhere. What lesson are you trying to teach me? The silence after that question was unbearable. When I was a boy, my grandmother used to tell me that pain was a kind of prayer. That when words fail, pain itself rises to heaven as a sound only God can hear. I thought about her then, about the wrinkled hands that once held mine as she told me stories from her Bible. Maybe she was right. Maybe this pain in my chest, in my heart, in my loneliness, maybe it was its own form of prayer, so I let it rise. I let the tears flow silently onto the pillow. I let the ache fill the room like incense. And I told God, if you hear me, just give me enough strength to make it to morning. At some point in the night, I must have drifted into a half-sleep. My dreams were fractured, memories blending with imagination. I dreamed of carrying my daughter on my shoulders through a county fair, her laughter bubbling over as she pointed at the Ferris wheel. I dreamed of my son handing me a crayon drawing of the two of us, stick figures with big smiles, the words best Dad ever scribbled above. And then in the same dream, those pictures faded. My daughter turned her face away. My son dropped the drawing in the trash. The Ferris wheel spun without me. I woke up with a start, my chest heaving, the monitors screaming from the sudden spike in my heart rate. A nurse rushed in, calming me, checking the wires. She pressed her hand gently to my arm. "Bad dream?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. Her eyes softened. "Sometimes the body heals slower than the heart, but you're not alone, Mr. Carter. You're never really alone." And then she was gone. Her words echoed in me. Not alone, but it didn't feel that way. So I prayed again, this time softer. God, if you're here, show me, because I can't feel it right now. As the hours crawled, I began to realize something. Pain wasn't my enemy. Pain was proof. Proof that I had survived the surgery. Proof that I was still here, breathing, however raggedly. Proof that I hadn't given up, even when others had given up on me. I began to think of pain the way my grandmother did, not as punishment, but as conversation. A dialogue between me and heaven. And so, instead of fighting it, I leaned into it. Each throb in my chest, each stab when I moved, it became a wordless prayer. A prayer that said, I'm still here. A prayer that said, I want to live. A prayer that said, help me find the strength to walk again tomorrow. Around 3 a.m., the loneliness reached its peak. I wanted to call one of my children to hear their voice, even if only for a second, but I didn't. I couldn't stand another excuse, another reminder that their lives had more room for meetings and soccer games than for me. Instead, I opened the small notebook again. This time, I didn't write about excuses. I wrote my prayer. Tonight, I feel abandoned, but I don't want my heart to harden. Let this pain teach me. Let it shape me. Let me find meaning even if I'm walking alone. The act of writing was its own prayer, a way of speaking when I felt voiceless. By dawn, the pain had dulled, not gone, never gone, but transformed. It wasn't just something I suffered anymore. It was something I carried, a cross, a weight, a reminder, and with it came a strange peace. Not joy, not comfort, but peace, the kind that whispers you can endure one more day. I looked at the empty chair as the sun filtered through the blinds, painting the room gold. Maybe you'll be filled someday, I told it. But even if you're not, I'll keep walking. I'll keep praying, because my strength doesn't come from who shows up. It comes from who refuses to give up. And for the first time since the surgery, I believed it. That morning, as the nurse came in to check my vitals, she found me sitting upright, notebook on my lap, pen in hand. You're up early, she said. Couldn't sleep, I replied with a small smile. But I learned something last night. What's that? She asked. That pain, I said, patting my chest lightly, isn't just pain. Sometimes it's prayer. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Then you're one of the strongest men I've met. I didn't feel strong, but maybe strength wasn't about how I felt. Maybe it was about the choice I made in the dark, to keep breathing, to keep believing, to turn pain into something more than suffering. And so, as the day began, I whispered one more prayer. Thank you for another sunrise, for another chance to walk. The morning after my long night of prayer, the hospital felt different. Not because the pain was gone, it wasn't, but because something in me had shifted. I had decided that pain could be more than suffering. It could be prayer, proof, even strength. Still, strength doesn't erase loneliness. I was eating breakfast when I heard a voice from the bed next door. They had wheeled in a new patient during the night. The curtain between us was half drawn, and all I could see at first was a wrinkled hand resting on the blanket, hooked up to tubes like mine. You always get the Jell-O too, the man chuckled hoarsely. They must have bought it in bulk back in 1980 and never stopped serving it. I looked up, startled, then smiled despite myself. Yeah, I said, my voice dry. I think it's been passed down like family heirlooms. The man laughed, a deep, raspy sound that reminded me of someone who had smoked too many cigars or told too many stories, or maybe both. He pushed the curtain aside a little. His face appeared, gray stubble, tired but mischievous eyes. He looked to be about my age. Name's Walter, he said. You? Carter, I replied. Well, Carter, he said, you look like you've been through the ringer. I gestured at his tubes. Takes one to know one. We both laughed, though mine ended with a wince. Over the next hour we talked. Just simple things, where we were from, what the doctors said, how the nurses seemed to carry the weight of the world with quiet grace. It felt strange, how easy it was to talk to a stranger when my own children felt unreachable. Walter said he had heart trouble too, a bypass just like me. You'd think after all these years our kids would slow us down, not the other way around, he joked. I smiled, but the words hit something raw in me. My kids, I started, then stopped. What about M? I hesitated, then let it spill. They haven't been here, not once, too busy, they say. Walter's smile faded. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'm sorry, that stings. Yeah, I whispered, it does. Then he said something I didn't expect. You know, sometimes the people who share your blood give you less than the people who share your hallway. I frowned. What do you mean? He shrugged, wincing as he shifted on the bed. My daughter lives 3 states away. We barely talk. But the guy who delivers my newspaper, he calls every week to check on me. Funny world, isn't it? I sat with that for a while. A stranger's kindness had outlived his daughter's presence. And now here we were, two men with scars across our chests, finding comfort in each other's company. Later that afternoon, a nurse came in to help me walk again. Walter watched as I stood shakily with my Roman 4 pole. "Atta boy, Carter," he said, clapping softly against the blanket. "Don't let the tubes win." I grinned through the sweat, trying. "You're not trying," he said firmly. "You're doing. There's a difference." His words hit me harder than he knew. My kids used to cheer me on. "Come on, Dad, you can do it." Those voices were gone now. But here was Walter, a man I'd met just hours ago, filling that silence with encouragement. I took another shaky step, and for the first time I didn't feel entirely alone. That night we talked again. Walter told me about his late wife, about the fishing trips he missed, about the dog he still called his best listener. I told him about my years working overtime, about the nights I stayed up with my kids when they were sick. "You were a good dad," he said quietly. "I tried," I replied. He turned his head toward me, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Then don't let their absence tell you otherwise. Kids forget, but the truth doesn't." I swallowed hard. His words were simple, but they carried weight. The next morning, Walter asked if I had family nearby. I hesitated, then said, "I do, but they haven't come." He nodded, no judgment in his face, just understanding. "Well," he said, "you got me now, and I promise I'll sit in that chair when no one else will." And he did. That afternoon, when the nurse came in, I looked over and Walter was there, sitting in the chair beside my bed, just reading a newspaper, sipping water, but he was there. Do you know how powerful that is? After days of emptiness, after nights of staring at that hollow space, seeing someone there, even a stranger, felt like medicine stronger than anything dripping into my veins. It struck me then, maybe love isn't about blood. Maybe it's about presence. Walter, a man who owed me nothing, had chosen to sit beside me. My own children, who owed me everything, had not. The irony cut deep, but at the same time it healed something too, because for the first time since the surgery I wasn't completely alone. That night as I lay in bed I thought about kindness, about how sometimes it shows up in the least expected places. I whispered a prayer, not the desperate kind from nights before, but a thankful one. "God, thank you for Walter. Thank you for reminding me that even if family forgets, strangers can remind us we're still worth showing up for." And as I drifted to sleep, I realized something. My children's absence had left a hole, but sometimes holes let in light, and Walter was proof of that light. It happened on a morning when I least expected anything. The sky outside was pale, almost silver, and the hospital hallways bustled with their usual rhythm. Nurses pushing carts, doctors murmuring in clipped tones, the occasional squeak of a gurney's wheel. Inside my room the world felt smaller, just me, the Roman 4 pole, and the steady encouragement of Walter. "Come on," he said with a crooked grin. "Let's see what you got today." I nodded, bracing myself. My chest still ached from the stitches, my legs still shook like they'd forgotten their purpose, but the determination burned brighter than the pain. With the nurse at my side, I pulled myself up, gripping the Roman 4 pole as if it were an anchor. Walter clapped softly from his bed. "That's it, Carter. 1 foot at a time. You're tougher than those tubes." I smiled through the sweat and took a shaky step, then another, and that's when I noticed her. A young nurse, no more than 24, stood by the door. She wasn't on shift for me, I think, just passing through, but she stopped, watching. Something about her gaze was different, not pitying, not clinical, just moved. Before I could speak, I saw the glint of her phone. She lifted it, hesitated, then whispered, "May I?" I barely had the breath to answer, but I nodded, and then she took the photograph. At first, I didn't think much of it. People take pictures all the time, birthdays, vacations, even dinners that don't deserve to be remembered. Why should this be any different? But it was. Because in that frame she caught something I couldn't see in myself. Later she showed me the image. My figure looked small, hunched, fragile, bandages strapped across my chest, tubes hanging like vines, but there was something else. My face. It wasn't broken. It was fierce. My jaw was clenched, my eyes focused, my grip steady on the Roman 4 pole as I dragged my body forward. I looked determined, alive. I didn't see a weak man, I saw a man refusing to give up. The nurse smiled shyly as she showed me. "You don't know how inspiring this is," she said. "Do you mind if I share it, just with the hospital's page, stories of recovery, encouragement? People need to see this." My first instinct was no. My children hadn't seen me, and now strangers would. But then I thought about all the empty chairs, all the nights of silence. Maybe if my own family couldn't recognize what I was fighting through, the world could, so I said yes. That evening she posted it with a simple caption: "Strength is not the absence of pain, it's the choice to keep moving anyway." By the next morning everything changed. I didn't have social media, I barely knew how to use it, but Walter did. He pulled out his phone and chuckled. "Carter, you're famous," he said. "Famous." I frowned. He turned the screen toward me. There it was, my photograph, shared hundreds, then thousands of times. Comments filled the post. "My dad went through surgery last year. This gives me hope." I needed this reminder today. What a warrior, God bless this man. I blinked, hardly able to believe it. All those strangers seeing me, not as a forgotten father in an empty hospital room, but as a symbol of resilience. The irony cut deep. My children hadn't even stopped by. But people across the country, people who didn't know my name, were cheering me on. By the afternoon, a nurse told me a local paper wanted to feature the story. "Just a small piece," she said. "Human interest, you know, it might encourage others." Encourage others. I thought about the countless times I had wanted encouragement myself, waiting for my kids to show up, only to be met with silence. Now, instead of receiving it, I was giving it to strangers. Something inside me stirred. Maybe this was the point. Maybe God was saying, if your family won't see you, I'll make sure the world does. Walter teased me, of course. "Careful, Carter," he grinned. "Next thing you know, they'll want your autograph. Maybe they'll turn this into a movie. Who do you want to play you, Clint Eastwood?" I laughed, though it hurt my chest. "More like Danny DeVito." We both chuckled until the nurse told us to calm down before we tore our stitches. That night, I stared at the photograph on Walter's phone again and again. Not because I liked looking at myself. Honestly, I looked worn and fragile, but because of what it represented. It was proof. Proof that even in the absence of family, in the silence of excuses, in the ache of scars, I had stood. I had walked. I had chosen life. And that choice mattered. But as much as the photograph gave me strength, it also cut with another edge. Because in the quiet of the night, I found myself asking, have my children seen it? Had they scrolled past their father's face on a screen, recognized him, and felt even a twinge of shame? Or had they kept scrolling, lost in their own lives, while strangers cared more than they did? The thought burned more than the incision on my chest. Still, I couldn't deny the impact. The next day, a nurse came in smiling, saying, "Mr. Carter, you've inspired the whole floor. People are talking about you. Patients are asking if they can meet you. Meet me." As though I had become someone worth meeting, not just another patient. And I thought maybe this was my revenge, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in truth. My children had left me alone, but I had found a way to matter without them. I had become a voice for others who felt forgotten. That night, before I slept, I whispered another prayer. "God, thank you for this photograph. Thank you for reminding me that even when my children are blind, the world still sees. Let this picture speak louder than my loneliness." And as I closed my eyes, I realized, sometimes it takes a stranger with a camera to show you the strength you didn't know you had. And sometimes one photograph can fill 1,000 empty chairs. They promised. That was what kept me awake that night, the promise. My son had called the day before, his voice hurried, distracted, but the words still landed like a lifeline. "I'll call you tomorrow, Dad, after the meeting, I promise." I clung to that promise the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. After all the empty chairs, the hollow excuses, here was something I could hold. A call. Just a call. It wasn't much, but it was something. So I waited. The morning passed with its usual rhythm. Nurses checked my vitals, Walter cracked his jokes, the television buzzed faintly in the background with news I didn't care about. Through it all, I kept my phone close, perched on the tray beside my bed, the screen glowing every few minutes as I tapped it awake, checking for notifications. Nothing. That was fine. He was probably busy. Meetings run long. Maybe he forgot the time difference, though we were in the same state. I told myself 1,000 little excuses for his silence. By noon, I still had hope. By 3 o'clock, I began to worry. By evening, I knew the call wasn't coming. It's strange the way silence can weigh more than words. If he had called to say, "I can't make it," at least I would have had sound proof that I still mattered enough for a second of his day. But silence. Silence was an eraser, scrubbing me out of his life one missed call at a time. I tried to eat dinner, but the food tasted like ash. I tried to watch TV, but the voices blurred. Every time the nurse entered, I glanced at my phone, hoping she would say, "Oh, Mr. Carter, someone's on the line for you," but she never did. The only voice that filled the room was Walter's. "Still nothing?" he asked gently. I shook my head. He sighed. "I'm sorry, friend, that hurts." I didn't reply. I didn't have the strength to speak. Later that night, I held the phone in my hand, staring at the blank screen. One phrase kept echoing in my mind: "Missed call, 0." It was more than a number, it was a verdict. I thought about all the times I had been on the other side. When my kids were young, if they called, even in the middle of the night, I answered. Fever, nightmare, car trouble, heartbreak, I was there, always there. Now, when my heart had literally been cut open, they couldn't even press a button. And yet the world outside these walls hadn't forgotten me. The photograph the nurse had taken continued to spread. Walter showed me more comments. People wrote about how they were walking again after surgery because of me, how they shared the photo with their fathers, how it gave them hope. Hope to strangers, but not a single word from my son, not one. The irony was suffocating. I had become an inspiration to people I would never meet, but to the ones who shared my blood, I was invisible. I tried to write about it in my notebook, but the words faltered. How do you capture that kind of emptiness? I wrote one line and stopped. The world is cheering, but my own children are silent. I closed the book. Around midnight, Walter spoke again from his bed. "You know," he said softly, "sometimes silence says more than words ever could." I turned my head toward him. "And what does it say now?" He met my eyes. "It says you can't depend on them for strength. Not now, maybe not ever, but that doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you have to find it somewhere else." I wanted to believe him, but in that moment I only felt abandoned. I prayed again that night, but this prayer wasn't about strength or endurance. It was about honesty. "God," I whispered, "I don't understand. Why can strangers see me when my children don't? Why can they write encouragement while my own family doesn't pick up the phone? Am I asking too much?" The room was silent, but somehow the prayer itself steadied me. Maybe answers weren't the point. Maybe just speaking it aloud was enough. By morning, I had made peace with one truth: the call was never coming. I still checked my phone out of habit, but not out of hope. I knew better. And strangely, that knowledge freed me. Because once you stop waiting for a call, you stop holding your breath. You stop living in pause. You start moving again. So that morning, I stood once more with the Roman 4 pole, sweat pouring, chest burning, and I walked farther than I had before. Not because anyone was watching, not because I was waiting for their voice on the other end of the line, but because I had decided. If the call never comes, I'll make my own noise. When I sat back on the bed, exhausted, Walter grinned at me. "You didn't need that call anyway," he said. And for the first time, I almost believed him. That night, as the lights dimmed and the room fell silent, I looked at my phone one last time. No missed calls, no messages. Just me, my scars, my notebook, and a strength I hadn't known I still carried. So I set the phone down and whispered, "If they don't call, I'll call myself. I'll remind myself I'm still alive. I'll remind myself I'm still worth fighting for." And with that, I closed my eyes, not waiting anymore. It started with an ache that words alone couldn't soothe. After nights of silence, of waiting for calls that never came, I found myself staring at the small notebook on my tray. Its pages were half filled with scattered prayers, scribbled thoughts, and fragments of conversations I wished I'd had. That morning, something inside me urged, write to them. Not to text, not to call, but to write. Letters. The kind of letters you hold in your hand, where ink bleeds and smudges because the words come from a place deeper than convenience. So I opened to a fresh page, held the pen like it weighed 100 pounds, and began with 2 words I hadn't spoken out loud in too long. Dear son. The words poured slowly at first, halting as though my heart wasn't sure it wanted to be exposed again. You promised you'd call. You didn't. I waited all day, staring at a screen that stayed dark. Do you know how that feels? To wait knowing you won't come but hoping anyway. My hand trembled, but I pressed on. I want to be angry with you. I want to shout that you've forgotten the man who carried you, fed you, sacrificed for you. But the truth is, son, I can't hold on to anger for long. It eats me alive faster than this heart disease ever could. I paused, looking at the words. They weren't polished. They weren't tidy, but they were raw, honest. I ended the letter with something I didn't expect to write. Even if you never come, even if you never call, I want you to know I still love you, because love doesn't stop even when visits do. I stared at that line until my eyes blurred. Then I tore the page out, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Not to send, just to exist. That night I wrote another. Dear daughter, you told me you were busy with the kids. I understand. I raised you to be a good mother. But part of me aches to think you can mother your children while forgetting the one who mothered you through scraped knees and broken hearts. The pen dug into the page, leaving indentations deep enough to tear the paper. Do you remember the night you cried over that boy who broke your heart? You called me into your room, and I sat at the edge of your bed until sunrise, listening, holding you. I would have done it again 1,000 times. Why is it so hard for you to sit by my bed for 1 hour? I wiped my eyes before the ink could smudge. But once again, by the end, forgiveness slipped through the cracks of my bitterness. I'm not writing this to shame you. I'm writing because I miss you. I miss the girl who once told me, "Don't ever leave me, Daddy." I kept that promise. I only wish you could keep it too. I folded that page, slid it into the drawer beside her brother's letter. Days passed and the letters multiplied. Each one became a ritual. After the nurses left and Walter drifted to sleep, I opened the notebook and let the ink speak what my voice couldn't. Some nights the words were sharp. How dare you forget me? How dare you say you're busy while I lie here fighting for another breath? Other nights they were soft. I forgive you. I don't know why you can't come, but I forgive you. Life is heavy. Maybe you're carrying more than I see. Some were filled with memories. Do you remember when I taught you to ride your bike? You fell and I told you to get back up. That's what I'm doing now, kids, getting back up even when you're not here to cheer. And some were just a single sentence scrawled across the page like a wound. I miss you. I never mailed them. I never even addressed the envelopes. At first, I thought maybe I would send them once I was home, once I was stronger. But the more I wrote, the more I realized these letters weren't for them. They were for me. They were my way of bleeding without breaking, of releasing the hurt without letting it rot inside me. Each letter was both a wound and a stitch, cutting me open but sewing me back together. One afternoon, Walter noticed the stack of folded pages in my drawer. "What's that?" he asked. "Letters," I replied. "To your kids." "Yeah, but I don't send them." He nodded slowly as though he understood. Sometimes writing is enough. Sometimes the act of saying it, even on paper, matters more than them hearing it. "You think so?" I asked. He smiled sadly. "My wife passed 5 years ago. I still write her letters, never sent, obviously, but it makes me feel like I'm still talking to her. That's what counts." His words settled in me like a balm. That night I wrote a different kind of letter. Not to my son, not to my daughter, but to myself. "Dear Carter, you are not forgotten. You are not worthless. You stood when no one thought you could. You walked when your chest burned. You prayed when the pain screamed louder than your voice. You are alive. You are strong. Don't let their absence tell you otherwise." When I finished, I folded it carefully, just like the others, and tucked it into the drawer. But this one felt different. It wasn't a wound. It was a reminder. In the quiet of that night, I realized something. The letters I never sent were shaping me more than they would have shaped my children. If they had read them, maybe they'd have felt guilty for a day, maybe even called. But would they change? I wasn't sure. But writing them had changed me. They gave me a way to speak the unspeakable. They gave me a way to love without condition, even when love wasn't returned. They gave me a way to remember that my voice still mattered, even if no one was listening. so the letter stayed in the drawer. A testament not to the love I received, but to the love I still carried. Unsent but not unlived. The doctor smiled when he told me the news. "Mr. Carter, your vitals look good. We'll discharge you tomorrow morning." His tone was cheerful, triumphant, even as though I should be celebrating, and part of me was. After weeks of tubes, stitches, endless nights, the idea of leaving felt like a graduation of sorts. But another part of me sank under the weight of a question I couldn't ignore. Who's going to take me home? I nodded politely, thanked him, and watched him leave the room. Walter gave me a half smile from his bed. "That's good news, Carter." "Yeah," I said softly, "good news." But the words tasted hollow. That night I called my son straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's Dad," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "Doctor says I'm leaving tomorrow. Thought maybe you could give me a ride, call me back." I hung up, staring at the screen, no return call. I tried my daughter next. She answered. "At least, Dad, sorry I can't talk long. The kids are screaming in the backseat. What's up?" "I'm getting discharged tomorrow," I said. Could you drive me home?" There was a pause, the kind that hurts more than words. "Oh, Dad, I wish I could, but tomorrow's packed. Soccer game, then a birthday party. Maybe you could take a cab, you'll be fine." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, I'll be fine. Love you, Dad, gotta go." The line went dead before I could reply. The chair beside my bed was still empty when I woke the next morning. A nurse wheeled in a cart with paperwork and said, "You ready to head out?" I smiled faintly. "As ready as I'll ever be." She helped me change into my clothes, a plain shirt, loose slacks, a jacket that hung a little looser than before. Weeks in the hospital had carved weight off my frame, but something else had been carved too. Illusions. My small suitcase in one hand and the Roman 4 gone at last, I felt both lighter and heavier. Walter watched me pack. "You want me to call someone for you?" he asked gently. I shook my head. "They're busy." He grimaced but didn't press. Instead, he extended his hand. "Then walk proud, Carter. Walk like you don't need anyone to clap for you." I gripped his hand tightly, my throat burning. "Thank you for being here when they weren't." "Any time, friend." He said, "Go show the world." So I did. The nurse offered to call transport to wheel me out, but I refused. "I'll walk," I said. And so I did, step by step, suitcase rolling behind me, jacket brushing against my sides. My chest still ached, my legs trembled, but I walked. Through the long corridor, past the nurse's station. Past rooms filled with families who clapped, hugged, took photos as their loved ones left. No one clapped for me, no one hugged me, but I walked anyway. When I reached the front doors, the sunlight hit me full in the face. It was brighter than I remembered, warmer too. For weeks, I'd been wrapped in fluorescent bulbs that never changed, days and nights blending together. Now the sun painted me gold as though to say, "You made it." I paused at the threshold, gripping the handle of my suitcase, and looked back. The automatic doors hissed behind me, sealing shut. Inside was the place where I had been broken open and stitched together again. Inside was the place where I learned that even empty chairs couldn't keep me from standing. Now outside was the test. Could I carry that strength into the world alone? I walked down the steps slowly, each movement deliberate. My chest throbbed with each breath, but I refused to stop. Cars pulled up one by one, families spilling out, wives helping husbands, sons steadying fathers, daughters hugging mothers. I watched it all silently. Then I looked at myself. A man with a small suitcase, walking alone, no one waiting, with open arms. And strangely, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just sadness, not just anger, but pride, because every step I took was mine, not borrowed, not dependent, mine. I hailed a cab at the curb. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, hopped out and loaded my suitcase into the trunk. "Hospital discharge?" he asked kindly. "Yeah," I said. "No one came for you." I smiled faintly. "No, but I came for me." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded with quiet respect. As the cab pulled away, I turned to watch the hospital shrink in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just a building receding, it was a chapter. I thought of all the nights of waiting, all the prayers whispered into silence, all the empty promises and missed calls. And then I thought of the walks, the photograph, Walter's kindness. For the first time, I realized something profound. I had gone into that hospital broken, dependent on whether my children would show up. I was leaving it whole not because they did, but because I finally learned I could walk without them. The ride home was quiet. My apartment waited, small, simple, empty, but it was mine. And as the city streets blurred past, I whispered to myself the words I needed most. You're not abandoned, you're alive, and alive is enough. When the cab stopped at my building, I paid the driver, thanked him, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The air smelled of spring, fresh cut grass, faint exhaust, blooming trees. I stood there for a moment, suitcase in hand, heart beating steady beneath the scar across my chest. I had walked out of the hospital alone, but I had walked out, and that was stronger than anything. The first morning back in my apartment was quiet, too quiet. The hospital, for all its beeps and bustle, had given me a strange kind of company. My small apartment with its ticking clock and humming fridge felt emptier than ever. I unpacked slowly, folding shirts with stiff fingers, lining up medicine bottles on the counter. But when I sat down on the couch, the silence pressed hard. I reached for my phone, still no calls, no messages, no "How are you, Dad?" No "Do you need anything?" The chair beside my hospital bed had been empty, and now so was this room. But I had learned something in those weeks. Emptiness doesn't have to mean defeat. Sometimes it means space for something unexpected. That afternoon, my neighbor knocked on the door. A kind woman, middle-aged, who usually just waved in passing. She held up a folded newspaper. "Mr. Carter," she said, smiling. "Is this you?" I frowned, confused, and took the paper. And there it was, my photograph. The one the nurse had taken of me, gripping the Roman IV pole, face clenched in determination, eyes set forward as I dragged myself across the hospital floor. Beneath it, bold letters read, "Stronger than ever, heart patient inspires thousands with his will to walk." I blinked at the page, hardly believing it. The article told my story, how I'd stood, how I'd walked when no one expected me to, how the image had spread online and touched people everywhere. It didn't mention my children, it didn't need to. The story wasn't about who wasn't there, it was about what I did anyway. I read the comments quoted in the article. "This man gives me hope for my own recovery. My father is going through surgery, thank you for showing us strength is possible. We need more people like him in the world." My throat tightened. For weeks, I had felt invisible to the people who mattered most. Now, suddenly, strangers saw me clearer than my own blood ever had. The neighbor touched my arm gently. "We're proud of you. Everyone in the building is talking about it." I managed a shaky smile. "Thank you." When she left, I sat with the paper in my lap for a long time. My scar throbbed under my shirt, but it no longer felt like just a wound. It felt like a badge. Because in that photograph, in those headlines, I wasn't a forgotten father. I was proof. Proof that broken hearts can still stand. Proof that strength doesn't depend on who shows up for you. Proof that I was stronger than I had ever been. Later that evening, Walter called from the hospital. "They showed me the paper, Carter. You're a celebrity now," he laughed, his voice raspy but warm. "I told the nurses that's my friend right there." I chuckled, the sound surprising even me. "I don't feel like a celebrity." "You don't need to," he said. "Just feel like yourself, that's enough." I sat in silence, grateful for the friendship that had bloomed in that unlikely place. A stranger had become family, while my family had become strangers. I wondered if my children had seen the article. Surely someone had shown them. Maybe a colleague at work, maybe a friend at the soccer field. Did they feel pride, shame, anything at all? Part of me longed for their call, their sudden realization. But another part whispered, "It doesn't matter anymore. You've already been seen. You've already been valued." The next morning, I stepped outside for a short walk. The doctor had advised light exercise, nothing strenuous. My legs were shaky, my chest tight, but the sun felt good on my face. As I walked down the block, an elderly man watering his garden looked up. "Hey," he said, pointing to me. "Aren't you the fellow from the paper?" I froze, startled. I guess I am." He smiled wide. "Good on you, son. Takes guts to do what you did." And then he clapped. Just a few soft claps, but real for me. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes, and kept walking. In that moment, I realized something. All my life I had believed my worth was tied to my family's recognition, that if my children didn't see me, didn't honor me, then maybe I had failed as a father. But here, strangers saw me. Neighbors, nurses, people who had never known my name before. They saw strength, resilience, courage, and maybe that was enough. Maybe strength doesn't come from applause in the living room. Maybe it comes from walking forward even when no one claps at all until the world notices. That evening I stood before the bathroom mirror, unbuttoned my shirt and traced the scar across my chest. It was jagged, raw, ugly. But it was also beautiful, because it told the truth. I had been broken and I had healed. I whispered to my reflection, stronger than ever, and for the first time I believed it. I still hoped, of course. Hope is stubborn. I hoped one day my children would come around, that they'd remember the man who once carried them, who once sacrificed without excuse. But hope wasn't my anchor anymore. Strength was. Strength that had grown in the silence. Strength that had been captured in a single photograph. Strength that no absence could erase. So as I folded the newspaper and placed it on my table, I smiled softly. They may have left me alone after my heart surgery, but I had walked out stronger than ever. And nothing, no silence, no excuses, no absence could take that away. When I first opened my eyes after surgery, I thought the hardest part would be the pain. The stitches, the burning in my chest, the weakness in my legs. I thought those things would define my recovery. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't physical, it was the silence. It was the empty chair beside my hospital bed. It was the phone that never rang. It was the broken promises, the excuses, the absence of the very voices I had once lived for. That was harder than any knife, any scar. I made it through. Not because my children came to my side, but because of something else, something I didn't see coming. I made it through because of strangers. A nurse who whispered, "You're stronger than you think." A fellow patient named Walter who sat in the chair my family never filled. A young nurse who snapped a photograph and without knowing it showed me the face of determination I couldn't see in myself. And then there was you. Yes, you, listening now, wherever you are. You who clicked on this story, who chose to spend your time hearing a father's voice that his own children didn't want to hear. You became the company in my empty room. You became the witnesses I prayed for. You became the proof that even when family turns away, humanity leans closer. I want you to know, your presence here means more than you realize. Because when you liked, when you subscribed, when you stayed to listen, you told me something my own blood never did. You matter, your story matters, your life matters. That matters more than applause, more than headlines, more than silence ever could. I don't share this story to shame my children. They have their lives, their reasons, their excuses. Maybe one day they'll understand what they missed. Maybe not. But I share this story for every parent, every grandparent, every soul who has sat in a quiet hospital room and wondered if their love still counted. It does. Even if the chairs beside your bed are empty, even if the calls never come, even if the people you gave everything to don't show up, your love still matters. Your story still matters. And your strength can outlast even the deepest loneliness. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Strength doesn't come from who shows up for you. Strength comes from what you choose to do when no one shows up at all. I chose to stand. I chose to walk. I chose to live. And in that choice, I found something greater than anger, greater than revenge, greater even than recognition. I found peace. So let me say this from the bottom of a heart that has been cut open and stitched back together. Thank you. Thank you for listening when others stayed silent. Thank you for filling the empty chairs with your presence, even from miles away. Thank you for reminding me that I am not invisible, that no one is truly forgotten as long as their story is told. I don't know what battles you are facing. Maybe you are caring for someone who doesn't say thank you. Maybe you are waiting for a call that never comes. Maybe you are carrying scars no one else sees. But hear this from me. You are not alone. If my voice reaches you, let it remind you that strength is still possible. Healing is still possible. Life, even after abandonment, is still worth living. As I close this chapter, I want to leave you with a blessing. May your days be long. May your heart beat steady even when it feels broken. May your loved ones see you clearly. But if they don't, may you find kindness in strangers, light in unexpected places, and the courage to keep walking anyway. And may you always remember, even when they leave you behind, you can walk out stronger than ever. So, from me, an old father with a scar across his chest but hope still burning in his heart, thank you. Thank you for walking this road with me. Stay healthy, stay strong, and never, ever give up on the power of your own heart.